Hey friends, we're going to do something new over here at What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, your favorite World War II podcast. For a limited time, we're going to be giving away M1 Garand M blocks signed by your host, Don Abernathy, Henry Sledge, and yours truly. Now, how can you get your hands on one of these? Well, first, you've got to be a Patreon subscriber, even if it's $1 a month. Second, be looking for our website or on our social media for details on how you can win one of these. And third, we'll just keep listening to our podcast and tell your friends.
Digital 410 proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts Don Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Henry Sledge.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, your favorite World War II podcast. Even though the theme song might still be growing on you, it'll never be like the original, but hey, copyrights. Anyhow, we have a special episode tonight, coming back for its 5th appearance, bringing a new record to the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast. Nay, mind you, maintaining the existing record, because I think he held the record at 4 repeat appearances on the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast. Not only that, but he goes back to the original format version. But before we introduce him, we cannot forget the other part, the other half of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, the guys you are actually tuning in for, our friends Jeff Copsetta and Mr. Henry Sledge. Gentlemen, how are you all doing tonight?
Just fine.
Good. Doing good.
And as I was saying before, here to defend his title, probably with a little more enthusiasm than my co-host, Mr. Jared Frederick. Jared, how are you doing, sir? Back for your 5th appearance on the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast. Let's bring the enthusiasm. Show the boys how it's done.
I'm pleased to be here. It's near the end of the semester. I'm just back from the Pacific, and I'm in good company.
And that is why you're here, because we saw the photos. We're extremely jealous, to be quite honest with you. And we're interested on how that came to be, what your opinions were, what you saw, and just the full rundown. But I think what we're going to do before we do that, because we don't want to put a screech and stop in the middle of that conversation, so let's just go ahead and get the plugs out of the way, get the mail call out of the way, and all that good stuff. So first and foremost, we want to thank everybody who has signed up for Patreon to support the show and support the channel, what we do here. And probably a week left, maybe a week and a half left, we're going to do the first Patreon prize pack giveaway featuring the new What's the Scuttlebutt coffee mug that's still not here yet. I'm still waiting. And our fine friends over at Warbird Coffee is going to hook you guys up with some free coffee. It's a coffee starter pack. It includes the P51D Mustang that has a horsepower level of 2. So this is your basic, get you through the afternoon, right out the end of the day. But if you're cramming for some exams, got to get up early, hit the road, you probably want some P47 with a horsepower maxed out at a level 6. So one lucky Patreon member who signs up for our Patreon will win this coffee pack along with a coffee mug. But don't fear, the prizes are going to continue. And coming down the line, too, are going to be some autographed M1 Garand clips for your collection. All you have to do is head over to WTSPWorldWar2.com or D-410.com. Sign up for Patreon. It doesn't matter which plan you choose. You sign up for the $1 a month plan, hey, that's good enough for us. You're automatically entered. If you want to do the $3.50 month plan or the $7 a month plan, once again, it doesn't matter. Sign up and you'll be entered. And we want to thank each and every one of those of you who have already signed up. And thanks for all the support. Real quick on a mail call. It's a follow-up message from our friend Sebastian over in Sweden. He said he would like to hear us talk about the atomic bombings in the podcast and also our thoughts on it. And then if Henry can tell us if he recalls any of his father's thoughts on the bombing that end the war. Clearly, we won't get into that tonight. We'll definitely add it to the agenda. That way we can all have well-planned, thought-out thoughts on the topic. And I think it would be an interesting episode because I don't know if we've ever really brought up the atomic bombings. And one last plug for those of you watching on YouTube. Behind me, you see the famous meme coffee guy with his drinking cup in the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast. That'll be a new shirt available here soon, too. And if you want to message us, you have questions, comments, and suggestions for the show, you too can do so at mailcall@WTSPWorldWar2.com. Now that we got all that out of the way, Jared, friend, how you been?
I'm excellent. teaching, living the good life of a professor, working on my dissertation as well, staying busy, but staying mentally healthy while I'm doing it.
Now, I saw about 6 days ago you were at an event on the Penn College campus. Is that correct? Or somewhere within the vicinity?
Yes, at Penn State, up at Beaver Stadium.
What sort of display did you? What kind of event was it? And what sort of display did you guys have set up over there?
Within our university football stadium, we also have a sports museum, and it's dedicated to every collegiate sport that Penn State has ever hosted. And currently, they have a really great exhibit that runs through the summer of 2025 that looks at the roles of Penn State athletes who served in World War II.
Nice.
And there's some really incredible artifacts on display that I'm amazed that have survived and that they were able to get to include in this exhibit. And so we were up there and we were promoting the show all before our football team's glorified practice, which is called Blue and White Weekend.
Nice, and it looks like you had a fan come by, and he looked at the crew, looked at you, looked at the crew, said, "You're the best dressed here, fella."
Yes, Coach Franklin stopped by, and there were a whole bunch of reenactors there, and I was in my navy blues, and he said, "You're the best dressed one here." And I said, "Well, if that's the case, you have to stop for a photo with me then," which he did.
First and foremost, I thought you said it was going to run to the end of 2023. The fact that they're stretching this thing out to 2025 tells me that they've invested a little time in probably organizing this thing, right?
Very much so. And considering that it coincides with the 80th anniversary of the war, it's entirely appropriate.
That's awesome, and the fact that it's right there on campus for everyone to enjoy. And props to you for, it's not often you see someone pulling out the Navy gear for a on-land impression living history display. So shout out and props to you on that. But without any further ado, we're all excited. We want to know about your trip, how it came to be, and how long you were there, and all the places you saw. Fantastic aerial photos, by the way. Those are some beautiful shots.
Really lucked out with some of those. The trip itself spans back several years. This was a trip that was several years in the making. A good friend of mine who was a history aficionado up in my area, a gentleman by the name of Dave Scott, introduced me to the Iwo Jima Association, which is one of the key veterans organizations in facilitating reunions for Iwo Jima veterans. And they are connected with military historical tours. And they are one of the chief facilitators of what used to be, and hopefully will continue to be, an annual pilgrimage to go to Iwo Jima. And so I bought my ticket in 2019.
Wow.
I was slated to go there in March of 2020.
What happened between then and now that would put such a long pause on that world travel? I only wonder.
And it was a very frustrating experience in having it delayed 3 years in a row. Even more frustrating due to the fact that had it just taken place 2 or 3 weeks earlier, I could have gone for the 75th.
And then you could have been just isolated on the island the whole time and not be able to leave and just really dig in and enjoy your experience.
It would have been very authentic, yes. But good things come to those who wait. And finally, several of the international travel restrictions were lifted. And in March of 2023, I attended the 78th reunion of honor rather than the 75th. And despite the wait, it did not disappoint.
No, I mean, because that time period pretty much stopped for everybody anyhow. We're all still 2 years behind trying to play catch up. So I'm sure it didn't really affect the momentum very much. I know Jeff's planning a trip to Europe. Henry's been down to Peleliu before. Is it maybe for the listeners who don't do historical traveling or battlefield tours? What's the the whole process like? And once you got there, what's the process like as far as going to the certain areas and just basically the logistics of moving you guys along and getting you to see what you need to see?
Mm-hmm. It was a multifaceted trip, and how much you saw it within the complete package was dependent upon how much time and money you had, I
Sure.
suppose. But my travels themselves were about a week. It took me a full day to get out to Guam, which is where our base of operations was, one of the nearest points of civilization to Iwo Jima. And then it was a full day of traveling back, 4 days on Guam, and then one very special day on Iwo Jima itself. For those who had additional time, there were additional tour packages that included, I believe, Tarawa, Tinian, uh, Pearl Harbor, either bookending it on the way coming or going. I can't quite recall. And so there were a variety of options available to people on the tour. But given how long that it's been since any Americans have been on Iwo Jima, and given the exclusive and rather sacred standing
Sure.
that it has, everybody readily recognized that that was going to be the crown jewel of the many treasures and places that we were going to be seeing and experiencing.
But looking at the posts and seeing all the traveling you did, it looks like as you say, you spent a couple days on Guam, and looks like they had some nice historical speakers. And actually, you had the privilege. I mean, especially at this time, a privilege to stand there with an actual Marine veteran. Is that Mr. Lewis Beauregard?
Yes, yeah, who's from North Carolina, and I also found out that he's a volunteer docent on the USS North Carolina,
Wow.
which my grandfather served on at the end of World War II, and so we had the opportunity to talk about that as well. And hearing about him, just seeing him reminisce about the landing ground that he himself landed on in 1944. He was never stationed on the battleship North Carolina, but he said, "I may be the last person who saw its guns being fired,"
Yeah.
because he saw it shooting at Iwo Jima as the battle was ensuing. And so it was all these subtleties and personal little stories that really brought it to life. And that's the one major regret, that I couldn't go for the 75th anniversary, because chances are it would have been a much larger number of World War II veterans who would have been able to attend 3 years ago versus now in 2023. So that's the one major downside to it.
Was there a particular thing about Guam that stood out to you as far as impressions go, or all overall appearance or experiences there before you went over to Iwo?
It's a fascinating place that has a mixed culture of the United States, Japan, and Spain, and it's somewhat reminiscent of Hawaii in regard to how it looks. It's this very much tropical paradise looking place, but it's very much this cultural melting pot where the American flags are flying from public buildings, but it doesn't quite feel like the United States in a traditional sense. And so it was a wonderful place to experience all sorts of different realms of culture, cuisine. There were a lot of Japanese tourists go there, and so had some fun interactions with Japanese folks and families who were likewise playing tourist. I would definitely, if you're into World War II or travel, I would definitely put it on your list. It's not a place that immediately comes to mind
Sure.
when we think of the Second World War, but it's a really nice place where you can go see World War II sites, but also live in a degree of comfort as well, rather than bushwhacking and putting up a tent somewhere.
Jeff or Henry, you got any questions about Guam before we move on to Iwo?
We flew through Guam, Jared, when I went to Peleliu in '99, and then hit it again coming out. No, really, really cool place. I mean, I would have loved to have spent more time becoming acquainted with the flora and the fauna and the entire, the World War II sites, but we just didn't have time.
Yeah, and oh, Jeff, did you have something to add?
Oh, no, go ahead. I've got a comment after you
Oh,
talk about
sure.
that for sure. Yeah.
There's so many World War II sites on Guam. It's also the site of our nation's westernmost national park, War in the Pacific's National Park. And so that for me as a former park ranger, that was a very interesting experience because it felt like I was visiting a national park in a foreign country, almost. And there's just a lot of fascinating sites along the two major landing beaches. You can go up in the trails and find uh, Japanese concrete bunkers and various emplacements. They have a really nice museum there. Of course, the naval base there is huge to this very day, and it's all built on the infrastructure of what was put there during World War II. That was one of the largest supply depots on the planet, comparable to a massive Amazon warehouse, essentially.
Yeah.
Because that was the for the last year of the war, that was the major jumping off point as far as logistics go. And so it was incredible to see all this history, but also to see the very active legacy of it still being used today. And what one of our tour guides called, I thought, which was very clever, he called it the island curtain
Yeah.
amidst our current days of international tension in the Pacific.
And it's interesting, and we'll get to Jeff's comment after I say this real quick because it's on top of my head, but it's interesting how much impact logistically, even to nowadays, that the war had in certain areas throughout the world that one could, even though a lot of these places are modernized today, one can make the argument if the military didn't need those places for military outposts, campgrounds, what have you, that they would probably still not be as advanced as where they are today logistically with some of the airports and housing and plumbing and electrical layout and just the overall city infrastructure from some of these places. I mean, we hear it all the time, and I think a lot of people overlook that throughout especially with modern day history.
Absolutely. Whether we're talking about Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, Okinawa, all of these places have had a military footprint since World War II, if not before. And for most of them, they've only grown in the 80 years since.
Go ahead, Jeff. You said you had a comment.
Yeah, that kind of you partially answered my question for sure. So that's well, first of all, we have a lot more in common than I initially realized. I'm kind of one step behind you there. You being a professor, I'm a high school teacher, and you getting your dissertation, and I'm working on my bachelor's. But grew up not far from Penn State, and of course Gettysburg was kind of a pretty hot spot, especially I think middle school age for us to go over there on school trips, things like that. In fact, I had I think a fairly famous Nittany Lion quarterback's mom who was my teacher. I don't know if you know, this is kind of going back, but Tony Sacca ended up being drafted into the NFL.
Vaguely familiar, yeah.
Yeah, when it was the Phoenix Cardinals from the Nittany Lions. So yeah, that was interesting. And I was also a former park ranger for 9 years, but state park, maybe not national. But my grandfather, and I talk about him quite a bit on here, he was a Marine from 46 to 48. So I remember, again, as a youngster, I kind of interviewed him for some school project, and he was, I guess, the occupational force on Guam just after the war there. And so, of course, no action or anything. But I remember him talking about just kind of the remnants of World War II, when he was there. It wasn't that far after, so they were still uncovering rotting corpses, and you could see he talked about the bullet holes in the concrete and the walls and the buildings. And you brought up a good point. Guam is again one of those. It doesn't fit with the Pearl Harbor, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, those hot spots that people, even a novice Pacific War historian, Guam is, oh yeah, Guam, Tinian, Saipan, yeah. But you're right. It had such a huge footprint, and that was my question: is what does that look like today? I'm assuming there's still a fairly large Chamorro native population there, and I know from meeting a few of them, that's still kind of a big deal. The way the Chamorros were just absolutely brutalized by the Japanese, and I hear a lot about, when you go to Europe, you're going to see that the people there, it's like it was yesterday they were liberated. And I was just curious, from your perspective, are the Chamorros and native people from Guam, does that still ring true with them as well, as what it was like for them and to have the Americans come and retake Guam in 1944?
And yeah, I will admit, I was sadly very ignorant on the role of the Chamorros during the Second World War, and I got quite an education while I was there, because not only are they appreciative, and they very openly express that, but they also have a national holiday that is really the equivalent of our Independence Day, almost, where they celebrate the return of U.S. forces, and they commemorate that every summer. The one major highway that goes through Guam is called Marine Corps Highway, and so the footprint of it is everywhere, in written language, in infrastructure, on scars that you can still find on buildings and in cemeteries, in the cliff sides. It's a lot like other Pacific battlefields in that regard, but there's a major civilian population living around it at the same time. And so it was quite the cultural experience for me, and being able to go and converse with many residents of Guam who have lived with this their entire lives. They've lived in the shadow of this their entire lives. And it was a relatively new experience for me, and I'm really glad that I could experience it.
Did you meet any older folks there who were around in World War II, or have they all passed on now?
I probably walked by some of them. I did not have the chance to converse with any of them, though.
Yeah, that would be an interesting conversation, to get what it was like to be a civilian and having that war come to your area and affect your life in that sort of aspect. We hear a lot on the European theater, but to get it from the recollection would have been a very interesting conversation.
The Japanese enslaved several thousands of the Chamorros, and many hundreds of them perished in building fortifications. And some of these bunkers that are still standing there, they're carved out of coral, really unforgiving material to try to dig into and construct around. And so the Japanese were as brutal in their occupation of this island as they were many others, unfortunately.
And so you spent a few days on Guam, and then, as you said, the crown jewel to the tour, the whole reason you were there. How was that experience?
It was otherworldly. There's really no other way that I can describe it. It was surreal. It was exhilarating. It was enlightening. It was also exhausting. Because I say this of any battlefield, you really can't understand it unless you go and trek it yourself, whether it's Gettysburg or Utah Beach, but Iwo Jima especially, because it is a horrible, godforsaken little island. It's very arid. Even today, as the landscape has healed, there's still relatively little vegetation. There's hardly any tall trees that offer you any shade, just a bunch of underbrush that you have to bushwhack your way through. And I could not, as I was trudging around it in 90-degree heat with 80% humidity, I could not fathom running across that landscape with people shooting at you and not passing out from exhaustion.
Carrying a 60-pound mortar or a 50-pound base plate, or
Right.
a 40-pound water. Actually the water cooled is a lot heavier than that. But yeah, it's just
I gained such a degree of empathy, and I teach a whole class on World War II in the Pacific at the college level, and I like to think I know more than the average person does about World War II in the Pacific. But to have that sort of experience, and Henry, I'm sure you can attest the same for Peleliu, how unforgiving much of its elements are. It takes it to a whole other level in understanding the level of suffering and sacrifice on a personal level.
So it was that hot? You think it was 90 with really high humidity?
Wow.
Wow.
With the real temperature and the humidity, not a cloud in the sky. On the flip side of that, it lent itself to be a picture perfect day, aesthetically, if not temperature wise. Which allowed us to get a lot of great photos, some of which you've all seen.
2 questions. One, I'm sure that made you really put some thought into when you're reading stories about these, combat interactions through the Pacific, about the thirst, the lack of water. I mean, here you are on that hot day. I'm sure you have plenty of water, all the water you could handle, and you're thinking, these guys had to survive with half a canteen of water for 2 days.
I could relate to that part a little bit closer than what I cared to, because unfortunately there weren't any water stations anywhere. What you had on you had to last you. And so I had a few bottles of water, but you can only carry so many at one time. And I was pouring Pedialyte into them as well. And I was very mindful to ration myself. But yeah, even the same, you work up quite a thirst.
It may behoove anybody who's thinking about taking a South Pacific tour to bring some of those like Propel packs with you that you put in your water just to add the electrolytes, help keep you hydrated. Now,
yeah, I took a whole box to the Pacific with me.
Now, a lot of the battlefield tours, especially over in Europe, you fly into the country, you meet up at a hotel somewhere, and then you hop on a bus and you drive to the battlefield. Obviously, down there it's a little different. Did you guys fly in, or did you take a boat over?
We flew in.
That's what I thought. How was that? Flying in, actually getting the overhead view before you actually set foot on the place and actually seeing Mount Suribachi and seeing everything from the sky. And did they do a few loops before you landed, or was it just a...
It was a phenomenal experience. There were 3 charter flights through United, and we all had to get up about 3:30, 4:30 in the morning, and we had to head to the Guam airport, and it was about a 2-hour flight from Guam to Iwo Jima, which really underscores just how isolated it is. Comparable. That's like the equivalent of flying from where I am in central Pennsylvania to Chicago. So it's a pretty good hop across the water.
Yeah.
But luckily, our pilots did 2 or 3 loops of the island on the way in, which allowed a lot of us to get some really great once-in-a-lifetime aerial photographs. And we were so fortunate that it wasn't cloudy, that it wasn't overcast, and the skies were so blue that they literally blended in with the ocean. You couldn't tell where the sea began and the sky ended. So it was some phenomenal scenery. And furthermore, on our way out, as the sun was going down, there was steam coming out of the island because there's still some volcanic activity. And so there was this sort of steamy aura to it that almost looked somewhat hellish
Yeah,
as we were departing.
Dante's Inferno.
Yeah, truly.
No,
Were you able? I'm sorry,
no, go ahead, Henry, please.
Jared. Were you able to get a sense of, like, obviously you went down to the landing beaches at some point. Could you get a sense of the underfoot conditions? You know, that that sand, and how we've heard how hard it was, the volcanic ash, to how it just sucked you in, and how I think it was hard for some of the tanks and Amtraks to maneuver up in too, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, you are absolutely right. A Marine who was there, I think, said it best when he said, climbing up the beach was like trying to climb through wet coffee grounds. That was so accurate. Because with each step, you sink down a good 5 or 6 inches with each one, if not more, in some circumstances. And you most definitely get a good workout with your calf muscles as you're going around. But yeah, just to add additional misery to what was already ongoing there. But as you walk around, you definitely get a sense of that. And I had a bunch of camera equipment with me, and I took about 2 hours of footage on the island, which we're going to edit together and put on my YouTube channel.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so for any of your listeners who may not be aware, you can check me out on YouTube at Real History, REEL, and we typically look at history versus Hollywood, and we may incorporate a little bit of that into this forthcoming episode. But by and large, it'll be a virtual walking tour, because most World War II buffs will never get there,
No,
just because
not at all.
it's so hard to get onto. And so I'm really trying to do this as a public service, so people can really get a sense of the terrain. I filmed my entire walk from the airstrip, which is what the Marines were fighting for there in the first place, and I filmed it the whole way up Mount Suribachi.
Wow.
What was
I
it?
can't wait to see that.
What was it like making that trek up Suribachi? Just being there. I mean, being who you are, what you teach, what you've read, how we all feel about, the Pacific Theater of Operations. What the hell was going through your head as you were walking up there? I mean, I can only imagine.
This may sound cliche, but it was nothing short of a religious experience. Because there's a trailhead at the bottom of the mountain, and it goes in a rather circuitous path. It loops back and forth. It's a 10% grade the whole way up. And it's the same road that the Seabees constructed as the battle was still ongoing, so they could have observation and communication points up on top of Suribachi after they captured it. And so you're not only walking on a historical road that has direct connections to the battle, but at the same time you also realize that you're walking on a massive grave. That within 50 feet of wherever you are, there's in all likelihood a body resting underneath the surface. And so recognizing that it was a huge tomb added an eerie element to it. And for most of us, everybody walked at their own pace. I'd say only about a third or a fourth of the total number of people that were on the tour made it to the top of the mountain, just because it's really physically demanding, and a lot of people just weren't going to be able to do it. And so there were moments where I was walking by myself, and you almost had the sense that somebody was watching you, that there were these eyes or these spirits from the past who were looking down on you like you were some sort of intruder. And I'm certainly no big believer in the paranormal or anything like that, but there are certain places and certain environments where you definitely get that vibe that the spirit of the past
Sure.
is still there. And certainly the Japanese very much feel that way too. But as I cleared one of the first loops on the trail, the enormity of it all really struck me. Because for a while, you couldn't really see too much because of some of the taller brush that was on either side of the trail. And I looked up, and there it was. There was this iconic rock face, over 500 feet tall, roughly the size of the Washington Monument. That's about how big Mount Suribachi is. And I had to shake myself for a moment because I thought, I'm here. I made it. And so I and a number of others, we took a number of breaks and stops on the way up, making use of whatever little shade we could here and there, and sharing water and Pedialyte wherever possible. But as you crown the top of the mountain, and I got footage of this too. You'll be able to see it in a few weeks, hopefully, as we edit the film. They had some makeshift steps set up, simple metal steps, almost like going up to a concert stage, that sort of setup. And there were about 8 steps, and I trudged up them. I can hear myself huffing on the audio of my video. And then all of a sudden comes in to focus this iconic view that we've seen in so many photographs. It was the view that Joe Rosenthal had when he made it to the top of the mountain. And you see a Japanese memorial, and then there is the memorial to the 5th Marine Division that stands on the site where the 2 flags were raised. And it was nothing short of spiritual. And all of us who made it to the top, we really took a degree of pride in the fact that we didn't get a ride up. We didn't take the easy way up. We hiked up the mountain just as they did. We weren't under fire. We weren't carrying mortar tubes on our backs or radio equipment, but we made it nonetheless. And to look down on the beach, to see the black volcanic ash, to see the fleecy white waves coming in, contrasting against that, I feel my words can't really give it justice.
As you stood up there and you looked out over the ocean and along the beaches and the black sand, as you were just saying, could you kind of almost visualize the naval fleet out there and what that scene would have been like?
That was very much on my mind. My grandfather was at Iwo Jima, and he was on one of those ships. And I took with me to the top of the mountain the dog tags that bear his name.
Wow.
And so there was a little bit of him that was marching with me as well. He was a signalman on the USS Lowndes, which was an assault transport ship. And his ship was carrying about a full regiment of Marines from the 4th Marine Division. And this is where we get into a little bit of family lore on my end, because my grandfather suffered appendicitis 9 days before the invasion took place. And he was in the beach party battalion for his ship. And so he would have been a signalman on the beach, relaying ship-to-shore communications as the waves were coming in. And because he got appendicitis a week and a half beforehand, he ended up watching the whole battle from the deck of the ship. And 2 of his really good friends died on Iwo Jima, men who he would have been alongside. And he himself may have been killed had he not had this medical emergency at the last minute. And so I very much get a sense that he suffered a degree of survivor's guilt the remainder of his life. He felt a degree of guilt that he wasn't with his buddies when they met their end. But conversely, I'm here because of it.
Yeah.
And so that's the strange way that history works. And it was this sort of thing that was very much in my mind as I was looking out into the water. And I was thinking of my grandfather, I was thinking of his shipmates, I was thinking of his comrades who didn't make it home. But you could easily stand up atop Suribachi and envision all the thousands of ships that surrounded the island.
Now, between Guam and Iwo, obviously Guam has development civilization, as you were saying, and Iwo's out there isolated. Was there a clear difference in, I don't know if preservation is the correct term, because, it's being weathered away, but as far as relics, debris, since you're on an island that's really not seeing much development going on, could you see a clear, defined difference in the amount of artifacts still laying around opposed to what you saw over in Guam?
I saw very little on Guam. You see, there were some artillery pieces with some damage. There are, of course, the concrete and coral bunkers. Very little evidence, though, at the ground level, at the surface level, where you could see the debris of battle. Iwo Jima was entirely different. It was everywhere.
It's like a time capsule.
Truly. We were walking down the dirt road from the airstrip to Suribachi, and we're literally kicking up pieces of shrapnel in the road as we walked. It's just everywhere. There's no other way to put it. Both substantial and small, it's everywhere. Anti-aircraft guns, a nose of a plane, which was right by the road. We were strongly discouraged from going into any of the caves for a number of reasons. They become physically unstable. We learned that it's actually warmer in the caves because it's a sulfuric island. It's still an active volcano for all intents and purposes. And it's actually 20 degrees warmer in the caves than what it is outside. And furthermore, we were warned that not all the caves have been cleared and that there's still tripwires, possibly, in some of them.
Just unstable TNT somewhere,
Yeah. And so, for that reason, we were kept on a pretty tight leash when we were touring. We were, in essence, confined to the eastern shore, running parallel to the landing beaches, going from the airstrip to Suribachi. Everything else was by and large off limits, and frankly, we didn't even have time to look beyond that. We were there for about 7 hours, and you really needed the entirety of that 7 hours to walk to the mountain, get up it, spend some time up there, walk back down, check out the beach, and then get back to the airstrip in time to catch your flight. So for folks like me who did the full round trip on foot, we got in about 11 miles that afternoon. But to get back more directly to your question, the place is just littered with it. And as we were descending Suribachi, and these are one of the photos that I shared on my Facebook page a few days ago, that was the best view that we could get of these old U.S. naval vessels that had been sunk as breakwaters.
Yep.
And the island is actually 30 feet higher out of the ocean than it was in 1945 due to ongoing tectonic activity.
Mm-hmm.
And so I couldn't get more than a half a mile, I would say, close to them, but you could get a pretty decent view of these ghostly, half rotted away, rusted vessels that were on the western shore of the island. And so, both big and small, the debris of battle was just everywhere. At one point, the other interesting thing too is that caves that were once very visible and open and apparent, a lot of them have since collapsed in on themselves. And so, in one or two instances, from what we could see, there were actually gun barrels jutting out of these huge embankments of dirt. And at first glance, it just looked like a random metal pipe sticking out of the ground. But then you realized, oh, that's a Japanese artillery piece that is within a collapsed cave, and the barrel is all that you can still see of it. But it was one of our guides that was with us pointed out that he was seeing more debris than usual because it had been 4 years since any tourist, for lack of a better phrase, had been on the island. And so every time it rains and that stuff goes into the ditches or the gullies or the road beds, the Japanese don't care about it. It's, everywhere. They're used to it. But it was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. And unfortunately, though, they were pretty strict on what we could or could not bring off the island.
I was going to ask you if they had a strict policy about treasure seeking.
Yes. So we had to, there were wand metal detectors that you had to go through before you could get back on your plane. But you are allowed to take as much of the black volcanic ash as you wish. And I have my jar of it.
Beautiful.
Right here. And I will be happy to send each of you some.
Please.
As a souvenir if you don't have some already.
Jeff has a nice soil collection, but my coffers are empty, so I would love...
Yeah, feel free to send some my way, too.
I will be happy to do that.
A couple things. I'm looking at your Facebook page, and that shot you're talking about when you're coming down Suribachi of the ships, they're far enough away, but they're old enough and bleached enough that they almost look like concrete bunkers on the beach. You can barely tell they're wood. And second of all, I'm surprised National Geographic has not contacted you to try to... You have 2 overhead shots of Iwo, and one of them is just beautiful. You got Suribachi in the foreground with a little tuft of cloud, and then you got the entire island going off into the horizon. That is such a beautiful shot. Congratulations on that. I mean, that looks like something you lifted out of a National Geographic's book.
Like I said, we were very lucky with the conditions that day. Despite the heat.
You're lucky you had the window seat, too. That's a beautiful shot.
Yeah, fortunately, a lot of the people who were sitting in windows were taking images, and they were kind enough to share some of them with me. I had an aisle seat, so I didn't get a good view going in or out. I was passing my camera around to people that I was like, here, take them, do it.
Landscape.
Yeah. And so I was like, just keep clicking. So, yes, we were very fortunate in that regard to get some good images.
Now, you're talking about the distance that the flight took, the amount of time, which struck me because obviously you're in the air and you're flying over there, and back then the men were transported via ship. And when we read the books, we see the little tiny maps in front of the books of the whole general area. We hear the phrase island hopping. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, but when you hear island hopping, you see these condensed maps. Okay, just generally you thinking these islands are pretty darn close together, but it took you 2 hours on plane. So it just kind of, it reinforces in my mind being Marines on these naval ships in these confined quarters for weeks, if not months on end, and then being transported into smaller LSTs and being cramped, and then all of a sudden you're on this island, and so you haven't had much movement with the exception of what little PT you got done on the top of a transport ship when no one else was up there. And so to be confined for that amount of time just to get from one location to the other and then be released into the wet coffee grounds, as the Marine told you, and then expect to survive, I don't think we put enough account into going from being stagnant and static to survive. I mean, if you're a runner and you go do a 10K or half marathon, most people go and show up 2 hours early just to get a warm-up mile in. You're not stuck shoulder to shoulder or, in these confined smoke-filled compartments and then saying, okay, here's 90 pounds worth of gear and some guns and good luck. Hope your legs don't cramp up.
Absolutely. And I was able to gain an additional degree of empathy a few years ago when I did living history on the USS North Carolina that my grandfather was on. And I got to hang out at his station and bunk in the area where he would have bunked. And so it was a wonderful experience that allowed me to connect with my family history. But at the same time, I learned that Navy life is not as easy as what people often think it is. Because in large battleships like that, when you have 3,000 or 4,000 people living on a vessel, sailing through the South Pacific, and the thing is like a humidor, it's like a sauna several decks down, with no AC, sailing through the tropics, it's like a sweat box. There's really no other way to put it.
Oh, and by the way, if you've ever read Lecky's book, anytime there was any sort of thought or fear of air attacks from planes or whatever, you got locked into those quarters. It was no longer go up and enjoy a smoke and breathe the fresh air. It's you guys are being locked in this hot-ass compartment until the threat's gone, whether it's 20 minutes or 4 hours.
Right.
And just in Tampa, we have the SS American Victory. It's a Liberty ship. And I've had the privilege of doing some living history on that because what they actually do, this is mobile, and people buy tickets and they go out and tour around Tampa Bay, and then they have a small handful of reenactors on there just to give people the ambiance and the idea, but not have so many that they're in the way. But obviously, I wouldn't, 6'5" wasn't that common back then, but yeah, being 6'5" and trying to, even the shorter guys, just trying to walk through a bulkhead with an M1 slung over your shoulder with a helmet and a pack on. You're constantly getting snagged on things, and it's just being in those confined quarters. Just, for a few hours is one thing, but once again, for days on end to get to where you're going and then climbing down a net and hopping on a landing craft and away you go.
Absolutely.
It just totally shines a light on it. Henry, Jeff, I've been doing a lot of talking. I feel like I always take it away from you guys. You guys have any questions, comments, or additions?
I've got two things. One's more of a comment, one's a question. I guess first the comment. Jared, isn't it interesting how history just knows what it's doing? Like you said, your grandfather, I can only imagine being in that position that not being able to go. I couldn't imagine that. That survivor's guilt was strong, and it never went away. But history knew what it was doing, because, like you said, he could have been, could have been among the heroes, but here you are now, and because of you, your grandfather, and all of his battle buddies, all the men he served with, are immortal. And I think about that a lot. History, the more we try to study it, the more you read about it, the more you try to make sense of it. Sometimes you just kind of got to let it be, because it knows what it's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're definitely a testament to that. And I'll try to ask a question that I think maybe our listeners would like to ask you, and that's, look, we've seen a lot of movies, we've seen a lot of Iwo Jima done. Is there, when you were there, right? So is there one that you kind of maybe reference back to, like, oh man, Letters from Iwo Jima, or oh man, Flags of Our Fathers, or even Sands of Iwo Jima? Were there any that came to mind that said, "Wow, they really got it right here"? The Pacific, of course, with a small part there with Barcelona. So, is there anything there that to kind of give credit where credit's due in the film industry? Sometimes we like to just totally destroy the some of their, oh, that's not right, oh, they would, did you think about that at all? Was there a sense of, I feel like I've been here before because I got to see this on the big screen? Was there any of that?
Those sorts of connections, I think, are inevitable. Because as we try to visualize battle, often the first visual frame of reference that we have is Hollywood depictions. It's just a natural inclination. It's the first thing that comes to mind. It's what's most digestible and easily presented to us. And along those lines, I really gained an added level of appreciation for Letters from Iwo Jima. Because of course it's not perfect, no historical film is, and you can nitpick and say, well, Kurabayashi, he didn't fly into Iwo Jima, he took a ship, and so on and so forth, and most of the characters in the movie are composite characters, and etc., etc. But one thing that I think needs to be pressed upon listeners when we think about Iwo Jima is that we often envision it as just this one iconic dominant feature in the form of Suribachi, and then there's just this black pancake that's attached to it. And that's not true at all. It is a meandering 8 square mile patch of ravines, cliffs, valleys, gullies that's a machine gunner's delight if you can catch a platoon coming into one of those ravines. And I think Letters from Iwo Jima does a pretty good job of showing the varied aspects of the terrain in regard to not only the cave system, but the cave system didn't emerge out of nothing. It's linked inherently to the geography and the geology of the island. And so even though most of that movie was filmed in Iceland and California, you can really tell for the shots that they actually did film there that they were taking good mental notes and visual cues on thinking, how do we recreate this elsewhere? And so I really gained an appreciation for that film after I had the chance to explore there. The geography of it is much more complex than what we often give it credit for.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was guilty of that until the first time I had a conversation with Woody Williams, and you're right. It's the 5th Marines. It's the 28th Marines, right? Like it's the 5th Marine Division. But in studying Iwo Jima's and reading about as much as I've done, and being, of course, a scale model hobbyist, I've done a small diorama about Iwo Jima, and
Cool.
It centers around the flame tanks of the 4th Marine Division, the meat grinder. And reading about the meat grinder that's a whole nother issue in itself. Of course, the 5th Mardiv got everything. They were just got everything pounded out of them because of those big guns, like you said, in Suribachi. But the topography and the terrain, as you start heading further north towards that quote-unquote amphitheater and that second airfield, and then even going again, like I said, with Woody Williams being with the 3rd Marine Division, probably the most overshadowed of those 3 main landing divisions there. So I'm glad you mentioned that because, I think you're absolutely right. That was a great analogy of, Suribachi and a flat black pancake. But, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that because that's kind of I've learned that myself, because we have this vision and what's given to us in theater. And then when you really start doing a deep dive, some of that terrain was just impassable. I mean, just to think that these guys, the Amtraks and Shermans, just could not navigate. And track vehicles they're track vehicles. They can pretty much go anywhere. So if they can't go, you can imagine how difficult it is for boots on the ground.
And you really get a sense of Kurabayashi's skill, because this was a guy who arrived on Iwo Jima the same week that the invasion of Normandy was beginning. And so he has nearly a year to prepare. And he only got a fraction of the defenses and tunnels done that he wanted to get done, both due to a manpower shortage and some of the strategic infighting that he was having with his commanders, of course. But it makes you quiver how much worse it could have been had they been even more productive than what they were. And they got a lot done in 9 months' time. But he really knew what he was doing in devising the defenses and overlapping fields of fire and just these killing fields that were mapped out and charted to the utmost lethal efficiency.
Yeah, one of the reoccurring themes on this podcast that ends up coming up when talking about the Pacific is how we as American nation really benefited from the infighting and lack of open communication between the Japanese Navy and the Army. There was so much of their stuff that didn't get done adequately or on time because of egos, not wanting to report accurate numbers when it came to deaths or damage or just even logistics. You know, how Guadalcanal came. Oh, we're going to go build an Air Force runway over here, but we're not going to tell anybody else about it. It's just we benefited so much from the lack of communication between their primary military forces there in that whole campaign.
Yes, and at the same time, one could argue the shoe was on the other foot in regard to that dynamic at the outset of the war, because certainly the U.S. communication didn't, or lack thereof better, didn't serve us too well in the first year of the war in the Pacific either.
That's true, too. Back to what you guys are talking about, the geography, and if you guys are listening to this podcast or even watching the video, please head over to WTSP World War II. That's WWII.com, and we will link to Jared's Facebook page. It's these photos, and I don't want to sit here and just talk about these photos, but I'm looking at another one from the plane, and you can see the topography. You can see the boulders along the beach. You can see like how deep in some areas the vegetation is just by the deep grooves from the roads, what roads there are and paths. And so when Jeff is talking about how traversing this island and fighting on this island, how difficult it was from the black sands on the beaches to the rugged terrain going up Suribachi to the rugged terrain on the other end of the island, you can really get a good grasp of that by just looking at these aerial photos of the island. I mean, the quality of these photos are so good thanks to modern day technology that you can get a real good idea of how bad it had to be to fight against just the environment, let alone the Japanese on top of it. You can see how rugged this whole island was just by looking at these aerial photos.
And that just attested to the body count for the Marines. I mean, yes, Kurabayashi's plan and the Marine or the Japanese that were so well trained at that time, but it's just the ultimate kill zone.
Yeah.
I mean, I just couldn't imagine, looking at how we conduct combat today with everything is so accurately laid out, and I couldn't imagine just seeing a sand table of Iwo Jima, just everything to scale. How in the world, like you said, one Nambu would just dominate so much real estate, just one well-in-placed machine gun, and then everything that they had was always just this mutual supporting fire. It was just, oh my gosh. Maybe it's best. Maybe maybe the military knows what they're doing every now and then. Just don't tell most of these guys. Just when the ramp drops, just run on the beach, get everything on there, clear the beach, and get as inland as quickly as possible, because for any of the planners and all this photo reconnaissance that was taken by the Air Corps and all the guys that studied those pictures from above, I mean, they knew they were throwing their guys into an absolute meat grinder. They had to. And bottom line, the testament of those Marines that hit that island and what they accomplished in 30 some days in that environment, the kill zone after kill zone, unbelievable. Unbelievable. Thanks for sharing, Jared. That's just awesome.
Oh, well, no, thank you. Yeah, one thing that really struck me that I wasn't really able to connect the dots to until I was walking around. There were so many accounts from Marines of where they had taken out a pillbox or a fixed position, and they had thrown grenades in it, they had taken flamethrowers to it, and then there's gunfire that starts coming out of it again. And they're thinking, what the hell's going on here? How could anybody still be alive inside that? But when you're there walking around, you realize how interconnected this labyrinth is, this subterranean tunnel system. And the Marines had killed the gunners in those positions, but men were being shuffled from other positions through the tunnel system to reoccupy the guns therein. And so that became all the more apparent to me as I was walking around, because you're thinking, oh yeah, like that's connected to that, and this tunnel's running underneath us right now. And so that was one of many epiphanies that I had.
Not to mention the eerie feeling of, oh wow, it was easy for them to wait for us to walk past and then pop up behind us and ambush us from behind, which was. So your overall feeling, experience coming away from this trip, this travel down to both Guam and Iwo, what was your overall takeaway?
It was in all likelihood a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It's not an easy place to get to. It takes a long time to get there. The island during non-pandemic times is only open up to Americans one day out of the year to coincide with the anniversary. And that is part of a treaty that the United States has with Japan that was created during the Vietnam War when Japan wanted the island back. And so it's very restrictive as to who can visit it and when. And unfortunately for any of our international listeners tuning in, you need an American passport to get on. If you're from Europe or Australia, they won't let you tour the island.
So there's no option to stay overnight?
No, none.
Okay.
I had no idea it was that locked down.
There's a Japanese naval airstrip on the island, and they are there for defensive purposes. It's part of this chain of military installations that circle throughout the Pacific. They are there for search and rescue reasons whenever needed. I think above all else, though, they're there to protect the place, to make sure that people don't come in and grave rob or metal detect or scavenge for valuables.
Can I ask a question on that note?
Yeah.
I know on Peleliu there's been this big movement for a number of years. It started around the time I visited in '99 of Japanese repatriating remains of their war dead. Is that going on Iwo Jima, or are they intact right where they were killed?
It's a little bit of both. Over the past 30 years, there has been repatriation, and they do a typical burning of the remains, and wherever possible, they try to take them back to the Japanese mainland. But for so many of the Japanese, they were killed in these tunnels that were dropped by the force of explosives or have collapsed or eroded with the passing of time. And the same is true of Peleliu, but it was entirely in the realm of possibility that we could have tripped over a pile of bones as we were walking around. But in short, yes, the Japanese have made effort to find bodies and return them back home. But I'm sure there are many thousands of them who are still there, unclaimed.
Mm-hmm.
Was that military presence felt when you were touring the island? Meaning, you kind
To an extent, there was a mixture of U.S. Marines and Japanese naval personnel who were on the island. And they were, by and large, there to play chaperone, I think. They didn't have much to offer in regard to water or medical assistance for people who perhaps needed it. But yeah, I had an Iwo Jima commemorative challenge coin in my pocket. It had the U.S. flag and the Japanese flag on it. And there was one Japanese airman who was particularly helpful for a lot of American guests, directing them and assisting them as needed. And I walked over to him and I gave him the challenge coin.
Nice.
And I bowed and I placed it out in my open hands, a very respectful gesture. And he was stunned that somebody was giving him a gift for doing his job. But in that moment, I thought, this is so poetic, because chances are my grandfather and his great-grandfather could have been shooting at each other at this battle or another battle. And here we are now, where our countries are not considered ultimate foes, but very substantial allies. And so I thought if that one little gesture can build just a little degree of goodwill between former enemies, then it was entirely worth it.
You had a picture of that on Facebook, didn't you?
Yes, I did actually.
I think I remember seeing that come across.
So that was one of many human moments that I was able to experience on the island.
I'm always jealous when I hear about these battlefield tours, but I'm like, it's talking about the fear of missing out. It's like, I would have given anything to have been there. That just sounds like just and I hate the phrase bucket list. I really do, but I mean, that's like the entire list there. I mean, just to be there and have those experiences, whether it's with, Lewis over on Guam, or having the ability and, well, one day to have the challenge coin in your pocket to be able to give it to somebody, but just the whole experience, all in all, just sounds like such a impactful time.
And I would say to anybody, yourself included, who's interested, the waiting list, the registration list for next year's tour is already open. My somewhat pessimistic speculation is that once all of the World War II veterans are gone,
The interest
the Japanese government may cease
to
have these open house days, if you will, for we Americans. And so if anybody is interested, I would urge you to look into traveling there sooner rather than later. Not to mention the fact that scientists have rated Iwo Jima one of the deadliest volcanoes in the world, and there's a 1 in 3 chance that there will be a major eruption there within this century, which will destroy the island completely and probably create a tsunami of apocalyptic proportions that will affect a lot of other island nations. And so someday the battlefield will not be there anymore. Mother Nature will reclaim it.
And it was like a little extra cherry on your traveling Sunday. You got to pass over Wake Island. That had to be a cool little surprise too.
That was a very nice bit of icing on top. And the pilot who was flying us realized that there were World War II veterans on board and that there were World War II aficionados. And he made special point to showcase the fact that we were flying over Wake Island, and I was able to snap a few good photographs of that as well.
Talking about nature reclaiming. I mean, you look at these aerial photos of these islands, and perhaps nowadays modern combat we take in consideration the environmental impact of war. But I mean, you're looking at these flyover photos of Wake Island, and that it's crystal blue right in the middle. The water inside of the island, the ring itself, and the waters around Iwo Jima. It's just it took a while, but you would have never known there were vessels being sunk in those areas just full of fuel and diesel and oil and bodies and metal. It's just the water in these photos. It just looks like nothing ever happened. It's amazing.
Yeah. That's true of so many battlefields. When we go to Civil War battlefields within our own country, and there's some of the most beautiful national or state parks that you could encounter, and to consider the level of destruction and death and wholesale carnage that took place at them, and to see them now as these bucolic, picturesque places seemingly frozen in time, I very much got that same sense, that bit of irony, if you will, in exploring some of these Pacific battlegrounds.
Before we wrap up this episode, we have a little segment we like to do called What You're Reading, but I thought it'd be fun since you're an author. We'll go, Jared, what you working on? We're interested to know. I mean, we've had you on for your last 2 books, and you got anything that you could even maybe allowed to peek or give us a hint about?
Yes, absolutely. I'm currently working on 2 things.
Because one's not enough. He's just a super multitasker and just keeps it going.
It'll get the best of me one of these days, I'm sure. But I just finished my next book that I co-wrote with a 99-year-old veteran of the Army 8th Air Force.
Oh, Jeff's like, what? Huh? What? What?
And his name is John Homan. He was a co-pilot on a B-24. He flew 34 combat missions in 1944. He kept a detailed diary and flight log. He's as sharp as a tack. And I met him I met him on a number of occasions, but about a year ago, I finally sat down with him for a substantial interview. And at the end of the interview, I said, John, your story is worthy of a book. And he said, well, I'm old, so we better get at it. But he's doing mighty fine at nearly a century young. And we've signed a contract. The book is complete. And that will be out in May of 2024. And that will be entitled Into the Cold Blue. And it will be an examination of not only his combat missions, but his training, his upbringing, and how he's come to terms with World War II history in the 75 years since. So that's one project that is in the works. And I'm also working on my doctoral dissertation as well. And that will be covering the World War II history of the Gettysburg battlefield. And that throws people for a loop sometimes when I tell them that. But many of our national parks were mobilized during World War II. And in the case of Gettysburg, there were psychological operations trainings going on there, really secretive, clandestine stuff. There was a German prisoner of war camp that was located there. The federal government wanted to scrap the Civil War monuments, and the park rangers were like, no, don't do it. And all the while, Gettysburg had this incredible, noteworthy standing of national symbolism. What does the Gettysburg Address mean? Is we're fighting for democracy overseas. And then, of course, after the war, the National Cemetery there is expanded in the same burial ground that Lincoln dedicated. And to top it all off, Dwight Eisenhower makes Gettysburg his home when World War II comes to an end. And so my dissertation, which will hopefully someday also be a book, covers all of that and this sort of cycle and repurposing of history, both from a practical and symbolic point of view.
You're just, I'm just, the amount of work that you get yourself involved with. And I mean, that what you just explained and that whole, I'm at a loss for words. I mean, I never even considered to put that much thought into World War II relations to Gettysburg and all the associations and that, and the idea that the Army's like, hey, this Civil War nonsense, it's taking up space. We need to expand. Let's get rid of it. It
was federal land, and federal land was being put to use at a time of national emergency. And the same was true of Yellowstone and Yosemite and so many other places.
We have a airport down here called Page Field. It's a small airport where a lot of private planes and people learning to fly and all that. During the war, it was actually a Marine Corps pilot training area and some infantry training area. And a family member of mine through marriage, his family had a cattle ranch out there, well past the airport, but where they used to do training. And not so much now, but I have a few of them, but when he would go out there as a kid, they would take metal detectors, and you'd find 30 and 50 cal rounds that just lost velocity and just fell to the ground. They're like perfect shape. And it's interesting to see that in this little area, the impact that we had over at Page Field and all that down here. So I can only imagine between the Battle at Gettysburg, plus all the training going on there, just the the Gettysburg Address, as you said, just the amount of history and the pride that area takes into maintaining and sharing that history. It's a beautiful thing.
It's the one exciting thing about the project, because there's been so much written about Gettysburg, and so many people wonder, what could you possibly write that's new? And I found there's actually quite a lot that we can write and learn about. So I'm very excited to share the story. And I think one of the big takeaways is that the military history of Gettysburg does not stop in 1863. 1863 is the beginning. And it carries on into subsequent generations in varied ways.
I'm starting to see a theme with your recent career. And that is putting a fresh aspect on already well-told stories. You got your Hang Tough book on Dick Winters. Everybody thought, well, what could we possibly learn new about him with all the Band of Brothers books and his biography? And you found a way to do it, along with your co-author. Then you had Fierce Valor, once again. That story about Spears, not as well as told as far as other books about Dick Winters, but once again, between the Band of Brothers books and the miniseries, you found a way to shine a fresh new light on that story, and now here you are finding a way to shine new light and bring a new angle to Gettysburg. It's starting to be a growing theme with your books recently, and congratulations on that.
It's what historians do. We often think of revisionism as a bad thing. It's often used in a derogatory way, but all of history is revisionism, because new research and information and materials come to light that sheds fresh perspective on stories that we think we know. And so I love the thrill of the hunt. I love doing research. I love finding new ways to interpret old stories. And I have a lot of projects yet that I would like to do.
And we are looking forward to having you on for future episodes to promote those projects in the future. And speaking of projects of the future, Jeff, you got anything coming down the pipe you want to talk about or promote before we wrap up this episode?
No, I just wanted to bring to light, when you guys were talking about Wake, we typically do what you're reading, but I'll go with do you recommend? And there was a great book that kind of really puts the battle for Wake. It sheds a lot of light on it, and I think anybody who wants to know anything about the Pacific to kind of be able to put all the pieces together, I really feel like they should read this book. And
Please.
it was John Wukovitz, Pacific Alamo, The Battle for Wake Island. And Jared, I'm assuming you've already read this one, and this just. It's one of those books, again, it's kind of one of those kind of in the background, right? Which is really a shame for these guys. But there's some great photographs in here. There's you really got to understand talking about island topography, but really understanding what Wake looked like, what the garrison had at their disposal, and how long that garrison lasted. And I think the lasting impression from those survivors of Wake is talk about missing the ultimate show. Because, they had no idea really what they were thrust into. And then to be prisoners of war for almost 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to live through it, to be part of it, a big part of that, the beginning of us being thrusted into World War II, but then being closed off from everything for 4 years. A lot of these guys had to learn what World War II was after they were liberated. And that really has kind of stuck with me after reading that book to be a World War II vet. Oh, what was it like in World War II? Well, really couldn't tell you because, they spent that whole time kind of behind closed doors. So interesting that you talked about Wake and Don for shedding some light on it. That was great. And it just reminded me of Wukovitz's book there, Pacific Alamo, because it's really, again, I think it's an interesting, and I think it's an important read for anybody that's reading and interested about the Pacific War in general, for sure.
I had this thought on the last episode, and I didn't even bring it up, but maybe the three of us need to work on a refined must-have books for your home library when it comes to the Pacific, and then we can do one on the European theater and expand it as we go. But I'm sure there's, a few that we all agree upon, but then, as Jeff just pointed out, this particular book that I'm sure he probably would put on that list that maybe Henry and I haven't even read or were aware of. So maybe that might be something interesting we can post on our website, for those getting into this particular theater of operations, and we'll put together one for Europe and on down the line. But maybe that's something we could put on our website as a reference guide. Here's some must-have books if you want to get the full view of this particular operation, and we can continue working on that in the future. Because it'd be interesting to see how many of us have the same book ideas versus, well, here's one you really got to check out. So maybe that'd be kind of cool, something we can to do for our audience as well. We can work on and bring up occasionally. Here's a book we're going to add to the list, and it might be kind of interesting to do. Henry, do you got anything coming down the pike, sir?
No, nothing that I'm going to mention right now as far as what I'm reading. I'm going to be in this in a while. Volume 3 of Ian Toll's trilogy, Twilight of the Gods.
Just for fun, show the side of that book, 'cause that's a thick brick.
Yeah, it is a thick book. But I tell you, man, Toll's a great writer. I mean, I'm very early in it. I'm like 80 pages in. I just right now time is really crunched for me. I can't spend as much time reading as I want to, but I'm really enjoying it. I mean, he's so articulate, such a good writer. And I enjoyed volumes 1 and 2 as well.
Jared, do you have anything else? I know you're working on putting that video together, but do you have any other projects or appearances anywhere you want to get the word out about before we wrap up this episode?
I'm always somewhere doing something.
It's a good problem to have.
We're always adding content onto our YouTube channel at Real History. We've been on a Civil War theme over these past few weeks, which have led to some very lively discussions. But yeah, we're going to continue to take a look at that. We have some things lined up for the 30th anniversary of the movie Gettysburg, which came out in 1993, believe it or not. That was the movie that got me interested in history. So I always enjoy talking about that. And as to, I'll be speaking at a few places this summer, and folks can see that list of events at my website, jaredfrederick.com.
Fantastic. And I want to thank each and every one of you for your continued support. And as I said earlier, please make sure you head over to WTSPWorldWar2.com, sign up for Patreon so you can get enrolled in the Patreon prize packs for giveaways we're going to start doing. If you haven't done so, please head over to YouTube.com, look up D410 Media so you can follow us and watch us live every Monday and see some of the other content we have out there on the YouTube channel. And for myself, Henry, Jeff, and Jared, we want to thank you guys for hanging out with us tonight, and we will talk to you all soon.
This has been a Digital 410 production.